My name is Clarence Hecker, I'm the Assistant Curator at this museum. Thank you for coming to the symposium tonight. I would ask that you please turn off your cellular telephones and other devices at this time. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Thomas Carter, Professor Emeritus at the College of Architecture and Planning at the University of Utah. He has spent close to 40 years in the study of historic architecture, with a specific interest in the vernacular style. He has published several books, his most recent of which, Building Zion, is a look at 19th century Mormon architecture in the Sanpete Valley. We are honored to have such a knowledgeable guest at our symposium tonight. Dr. Carter will present for approximately 50 minutes, after which he will take your questions. Now, without further ado, I present Dr. Thomas Carter.
This is really great. It's a little bit weird, I spent my life, kind of doing these kinds of talks. I taught school for 30 years, and then I retired, and now I actually don't do this anymore. And I was thinking, wow, like, what happens when your mouth opens? Does it actually, does something come out? And it's really odd, to be emeritus. But I think it's a time for me, more than anything else, I think, is to reflect a little bit about sort of a career that I don't know, call it checkered, but it certainly was one that I didn't intend. I think maybe most people are like that, where you maybe you start out with a dream. I was talking to Clarence, and I will like to thank Clarence and Luke Austin for inviting me. But I was telling him, I really wanted to be a fiddle player and an ethnomusicologist, and frankly, I wasn't really all that good at either one of them, and so it's sort of by default I got interested in buildings, and in fact probably allowed me to actually get a job. I think if I'd have graduated with a PhD in ethnomusicology with a specialty in American fiddling, my chances of like working anywhere, at least or anywhere that I could think of anyway, were pretty remote. So I really was lucky to have had a really wonderful career studying buildings, folk buildings. My degree is from the Folkland Institute at Indiana University, and I I guess naturally was drawn to these kinds of buildings because I'd been interested in traditional fiddling and in traditional music and so forth. And these were the kind of buildings that the old guys that I knew lived in. And so we kind of, it was a natural kind of, move, I guess, a shift for me. But it also was one of what I call an amazing kind of trip of discovery, because one of the things that I learned very quickly was that if you're interested in these kinds of buildings, and I'm going to be talking about Scandinavian buildings here in the Sanpete Valley, if you're interested in these kinds of things, it means that you're going to be the first person basically that studied them. Most of this, 99% of these kinds of building stuff they lie outside of the sphere of regular architectural history. Most architectural historians, if they're interested in a place like Sanpete at all, might study the temple or the library here, the Prairie School library that you have, or something. But it would be very rare, and these kind of exceptional buildings of stylistic buildings. But if you wanted to kind of really look at the things that most people built and most people lived in and most people used, you'd be the first person to look at them. And so one of the things that I found is that what I was really involved in was a process of discovery. I was looking at buildings and particularly early Mormon buildings that had not been studied. And I'm no stranger at all to Sanpete. I came here in the summer of 1978 to write a dissertation. I partly came here because of my friend Craig Paulson, who I had gone to high school with. I hadn't seen for a long time. Who moved down here with Melissa, his wife, and but also because Sanpete really, I'll say, I can, and I'll still say this, is probably the place, if you want to look at early Mormon buildings in the West, this is the place you want to do it. It was settled early, 1849, just 2 years after they came to, the Mormons came to the Great Salt Lake. It was built up pretty rapidly after the Indian Wars were over in the 1860s. It was a temple area. It had a temple, and it had that whole building activity that was involved with temple building. And then it, for better or worse, it lies just far enough off the Wasatch Front that it was, I'll say saved from some of the development that you see other places. And so other people would say, well, we could have used some of that. But at the same time, for me as a historian, particularly in the late 1970s, it offered this incredible laboratory, this incredible place to say, what was early Mormon architecture like? Well, you can't go to Salt Lake, at that time because it was gone. There were a couple of buildings. There was obviously the Temple Square and so forth. But if you wanted to look at how ordinary people lived and what they did and what that says about the world that they were trying to build, then you had to go somewhere else. And so I looked all over the Mormon West, and did a survey, and Sanpete just kept coming back. This is the place where there were the most buildings, and they were the earliest, and certainly, the most diverse in terms of the kind of people that settled here and so forth. And so I moved here in '78, and I said I wrote a dissertation that's totally unavailable and unreadable, and as they all are. But finally, and it took me a long time. Although I will say I have to always kind of let people know that I was working on other things. I wasn't just. It didn't take me 40 years to write this book. But in some ways it did, because it's really a history of the whole valley, not just the housing. My dissertation was really just looking at the domestic architecture. And ultimately, the book, and I do have a couple of copies if anybody's interested in buying one. They really deal with everything, from the town planning to the main streets to the meeting houses to the temple itself. And so, and again, as a non-Mormon, as a Presbyterian kid, I think that last chapter on the temple took me, it was quite formidable, but I'm really proud of it. So if anyone's interested, I do have a couple of copies. So part of this then, it really became, really a life project for me. I'm still learning. I actually drew this afternoon while Craig was finishing up some work and Melissa was looking for turkeys. I ended up, finishing drawing a house that I had always wanted to know a little bit more about. So it's a life project for me, and there's so much here that's remarkable. And as part of this, part of discovery, this journey or whatever. I will say that the kind of work I do is a very different kind of architectural history. I'll have to explain a little bit, but it's based on fieldwork. If you're going to study the unstudied, basically you have to figure out how to gather information about it. And what we need is you need to have some information about where it came from, who built it and when, but you also need to know about the architecture itself. And the only way you can really understand that is by drawing buildings. And so a floor plan to give you the space, the spatial dimension, the construction techniques. This is a house, the Rosser Thomas house out in Wales, who was built by a Welshman out there, Welch family. And we turn these into measured drawings so that you can kind of see. So this becomes our evidence. This is the data that archaeologically driven architectural historians like myself. This is our data. This is what we read. We try to, we take obviously other kinds of written documents, but basically what we really are interested in is seeing what the houses, the buildings, what they say. What can we learn by looking at them? And so, my work here in the Valley and really in the West in general, my big project really is to finish this. Is my book on the American West and in the early vernacular architecture of the West. But I was right. I'm lucky, I think, just to have finished the Mormon part. But it's been that kind of the process of discovery through fieldwork, studying the unstudied to try to understand the people who built these buildings. And which brings us to the Scandinavian question. And as most of you know, particularly if you've grown up or studied Sanskrit at all, is that early Mormon, the early Mormon population was comprised heavily of Scandinavians. The Scandinavian mission was opened in 1850. It was right at the same time that the Danes abolished the idea of a state church. So the Lutheran Church, ceased being the state church in 1850, and the Mormons show up, and there's a lot of people who are interested in looking at new religions and new different kinds of ways of worship. They were also interested in Denmark in the 1850s is going through industrialization, and so there are a lot of people, the old villages were being broken up. People who used to supply cabinet, like furniture and pottery and all of the kinds of that were involved in a village economy. That way of life is disappearing, and so there's a lot of people who are moving from the country to the city. They have now kind of the freedom to look for other religions. The Mormons promise not only a new dispensation, in terms of heaven, but also a way, boat ticket to America, and that was a big draw. Almost I think I think there were 8 million Danes or something, and almost 1 million leave. And so they're really it's a tremendous migration. Most of them end up in the upper Midwest, but about 30,000 come to Utah before 1880. And a good number here in the Valley. And so one of the things that I was really interested in as I started this study was to understand what influence did the Scandinavians have on the early material culture, and particularly for me, the architecture and the furniture, the things that I was most interested in and it was most visible. What impact did Scandinavian traditions have on these kinds of objects here in Utah? And if you think about it, there's a historical problem, that's involved in this. And what it is that for so long, I think people have looked back at early Mormon society and looking at it as a very uniform, rigid, authoritarian kind of world where everybody was kind of in lockstep, and if you came, didn't matter where you came from, you were supposed to be a good Mormon and dress a certain way and build a certain way, and so that most people who had written about Scandinavian culture in Utah had said, well, they came here and they became Mormons, and so they abandoned all of their old world identity. When they became Mormons, they said, well, we don't want to be Danes anymore. We're going to leave all that stuff behind. So one of my questions, and Craig's Norwegian, so we talked a lot about this, but one of the things that we were interested in was there in fact some kind of Scandinavian influence here? Because nobody had really looked at it. They had just assumed, because all these houses, to tell you the truth, in mid-19th century, neoclassicism, and that's a great architectural history word, but it's the revival of Renaissance architecture in the late 18th and early 19th century all over the world. So we call it neoclassical because it's it's the new version of classicism. It becomes ubiquitous. I mean, everything, and we identify it by symmetry. You know, the door in the middle, and then the windows on both sides, and you know, and you're going to see these all over. But people looked at this and they say, well, all these buildings look the same. So they must be all, they got the door in the middle, so they must all be English. And I thought, well, let's find out. Let's test it. And so I started this survey, and I went to Ephraim. I started in Ephraim, and I probably tell too many stories. So, but I remember as a kid, coming from back east, and I had long hair, and I just thought, and I was a Presbyterian kid, and I just thought, oh my God, I'm never going to get in any of these houses, and people said, oh, you'll be okay, So I remember I started my fieldwork, and there was a house in Ephraim, and it was really an important house for me. It wasn't this one, and I will tell you about this one, but I knock on the door, and then I step back, because that's what you do back east, I mean, you go to the, let me tell you, you go up to the porch, you knock on the door, and then you walk away, you get off the porch, I guess to give people a better shot at you or something. But you don't want to be too, intimidating or, too present. And so I did that, and I didn't hear anything. And I could hear a TV. The door was it was summertime. The screen door was open. And and I hear this. So I know somebody's there. And so as I do it again, I knock on the door, and then I get back off the porch, nothing, So finally I did it the third time, knock on the door, and I kind of look at this time, and I just hear a voice from inside that said, "Come on in." And I'm thinking, really, So I walk in, and there's a woman who at the time I thought was really old, although she was about my age now, It's funny how that kind of changes, But anyway, and she was watching this movie, and I started to talk, and she goes, "Shh." And I'm going, what, really? So I remember the movie. It was a World War II movie with a submarine or something, where the guy gets, he has to hold on to the submarine and it goes down. I don't know, the whole thing. But I can remember that movie. We watched about 20 minutes of it at the end. And then finally she got up and turned off the TV and came over and said, "Now what do you want?" And I think I told her I'd forgotten. But in fact, that's the kind of welcome I found here. And I will say that, I've really probably know Sanpete better than anybody, because I've been in over about 250 houses. For my work, I think I drew about 200 houses, and involved, which involves getting inside and measuring them. And people were going, "Oh yeah, okay, sounds good," But what I found right off the bat was a house that I'd never seen before. And I don't want to make this into too long a story, but because I do have that tendency. But what happened is that you'll notice it has 3 rooms. It's 3 rooms wide. And you think, well, that's not a big deal. Except for the fact that you don't see these in America. Anglo-Americans build houses that are 2 rooms wide. And you might say, oh, that's not true. It's true. I've drawn these. And these are just from Spring City. These are just 2-room houses from Spring City that are part of in my book. But you'll see that basically it's a 2-room kind of, we call them hall and a parlor, an old living room and a parlor that was actually the parents' best bedroom, so that they could be separated from the children that were always over here. But so that model, sometimes as a passage, it could have a little, stair passage, but it was a 2-room wide house. And so, I'm looking at these houses going, wow, these are really different. I've never seen anything like this. And I thought, they've got to be Danish. Except, when I looked at the Danish material, let me see if I can make sure. Yeah, so I knew they weren't English or American or Mormon or whatever, but they weren't. This is an old style Danish house They call them longhouses, and you can see that they're pre-symmetrical. I mean, they're sort of pre-Renaissance and stuff, but they have a big kitchen in the middle, and then a series of rooms. So this is a farmhouse, probably from the early 1800s. This one is earlier, but this is the kind of house that that a peasant farmer in Denmark would have probably been living in. So, I did find a three-part house, a three-room house, and they were in Sweden. But you'll see that that the interior room is very small compared to that one we saw, the Claus Andersen house down in Ephraim, he was a Dane. And so this house, this is the Parstuga, which means Pear House, And so I kept thinking, well, I've got to find the origins of the Danish Parstuga. Because in fact, the Danes didn't build these houses, and there were so few Swedes here in the valley that they couldn't have probably been that influential. So anyway, I really wanted to find, the origins of this house, this three-part house, this what I call, at the time, Parstuga, or a Pear House, because it had a main room with a pair of rooms on either side. And so I got a fellowship, Fulbright, to go to Denmark for a year in 81 to try to see look for the origins of these three-part houses, these Parstuga houses in Denmark. And I saw them from a distance. This is southern Denmark, And I worked hard. I just wanted to let everybody know that it was a hard job, but I was able to manage to get through it. And I was really helped greatly by people at the National Museum in Denmark, in Copenhagen. Bertha Friis and Lisbeth Jorgensen, who were a couple of field workers that really, because most people in Copenhagen spoke English, but once you got out into the countryside. And we started in fact finding these little three-part houses, what I'm starting to call now three-part houses, or they're Danish Parstuga, but it's quite, to make a long story short, what happens is what happens in Denmark is there's a particular amongst the very wealthy, the elite, the landowners. There is an embracing of this new neoclassical, this Renaissance type of architecture, beginning in the mid 18th century. And this is it's called Fribo's Villa, just outside of Copenhagen. It was a landed estate just outside of the city. And you can start seeing, our house, embedded in these villas. Basically, these would have been the gentry, and in Danish they're called hergård. They're these big houses that you start seeing in the countryside. And what happened is that, and this is a little chart that I made because what happens is that this villa house, this new kind of house, starts kind of penetrating into middle class, Danish culture by about the time that the Mormons start, their proselytizing, and right around the middle of the 19th century. These houses start showing. So we start seeing, and I always recognize them because of the two chimneys on the roof, usually that are spread apart just a little. So you can tell, because the chimneys are always going to be on an interior wall. So you can tell that, the fact that there's a bigger room here in the middle, and then rooms to the side. And there's a number of variations, and I did a lot of field work, and so that so here on the left are the older ideas. This is the old Danish longhouse. This is the old Swedish Parstuga. This is the new idea, which is this three-part villa house that starts again with the very rich, probably in the 1750s, 1760s. But by the early years of the 19th century, 1810, 20, you start getting variants of it as a middle-class house. And And what I found is that, this is in Sweden, you start getting, instead of the very small interior room, you start getting the this bigger, a very symmetrical, very much more spatially useful room in terms of a number of different kinds of functions. And then in Denmark, two different kinds of forms. You either have a house, a big house that has 2 rooms deep with lots of small rooms, or you get our 3-part house, our villa house. And what happened is that I think this one's simpler, and but it's the one that they brought here. And so these are these 3-part houses in Aarhus, which is out on the Jutland Peninsula, which is where most of the Danes came from who emigrated to Utah. This is in Zealand, outside of Copenhagen, on the right, on the left. Both of these houses have these 3-part plans. And so the question, with the Scandinavians who converted to Mormonism, most of whom came from the poorer peasant classes who would never have been able to build one of these houses in Denmark, would they have known about these? And probably, well, we know certainly just from, as I was drawing houses and talking to people, they would show me, pictures from their family albums, of Denmark.